Welcome, everyone. Happy Tiger Tuesday as we gear up for the semester. This session focuses on inclusion and accessibility as part of belonging. As you'll see from the title slide, um, with you today, you have folks from two different offices that fall under the larger division of OIE. We'll explain that in the next slide, but we want to focus this session on a couple of things that all fall under this idea of belonging. First up, when I get through the intro, my colleague Steven's going to focus in on how organizations can think about ways to increase belonging through accessibility. So that'll be the first part of the session, and then I'll be back to talk about a particular skill set under this idea of dialogue. How do we build skills for your orgs to better manage when there's a strong difference of perspective or opinion, or even an occasional heated debate or what feels like an actual argument? But the shameless plug slides we'll do first. Hopefully you're becoming more and more familiar with the Office of Inclusion. It's a division that has three different departments. Today you've got staff from two of those departments. So Stephen will explain more about ADS as an important resource for students. Our colleagues in the CSD, another useful resource for many student orgs. The department that I lead, Inclusive Excellence Education Support. We're the team of educator, facilitator, trainers, belonging consultants, and then the larger vice president's office assists with initiatives. So you have those teams. I'm going to do a really quick refresher. Returning students at TU have received this discussion around DE&I along for a while now and multiple times in your TU career. As a quick reminder, we think about diversity as difference. We think about equity as fairness. It's important to think about inclusion where everyone feels like they can participate and belong. And we also want to highlight a full definition of inclusion requires talking about and continuing to grow about accessibility. So that's sort of the key pillars of the work that's behind all the work that's coming out of our division. It's useful to think about a full sense of inclusion, not just including accessibility, but thinking about inclusion for all kinds. Stephen will say much more around accessibility in his session. One of the ways we've begun to define it for new members of the community, new students, and new employees is thinking about first starting with the idea that when we think of the word disability, often we think, oh, we can tell when someone has one or more disabilities. It's really important to get more and more comfortable with the idea that some disabilities are apparent and some are not. Ultimately, this refresher means that if we try to continue to pursue to achieve all three at TU, we're continually monitoring and pursuing diversity of all kinds. We're continuing to monitor and enforce equity in our practices, and we want to achieve full inclusion, including disability inclusion. We hope when we achieve and maintain all of those, it should look like and feel like that sweet spot of authentic belonging. That's the philosophy behind the work out of our departments. I'm going to pass it over to Stephen for the deeper dive on accessibility.
Okay. My name is Stephen Williams. We're going to talk about accommodations, accessibility, and affirming disability. We're going to keep it centered around stuff relevant to clubs, but I am going to do some shameless plugs post this. I can't do the slide, Brian. You got to do it. All right, cool. Before we get into what accessibility is definitionally, Brian noted something very important, which is there are apparent and there are non-apparent disabilities. On campus, 1 in 4 in the United States, 1 in 4 people have a disability. And so when you think of your student organizations and when you think of interacting with our campus community, if you're in a room with more than 4 people, you're likely in a place in which someone with a disability exists and could benefit from a certain level of access. The other thing is everyone can benefit from a certain level of access. So I'm going to ask a question because we were talking about a parent versus non-apparent. But what percentage of students registered with our office do you think have non-apparent disabilities? So ones that you wouldn't be able to visibly see. You can go ahead and throw it in the chat. 50, 70. We're hitting around it. 60, 75. All right, Riley, it's 75% of students. 83 is very specific, but it's 75, about 75%. Maybe 83 is closer. I just did a estimate based off of a couple pie charts over the last about 5 years, but about 75% of students registered with our office have non-apparent disabilities. And that's to say you never know what room you're walking into and how much accessibility can support students. So when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about when a person can acquire the same information and engage in the same interactions slash enjoy the same services such as clubs as a person without a disability with equivalent use or ease of use, right? So we're going to hit a couple of areas that impact student clubs, and we can think about accessibility in a more holistic way. So promotion. Think about when you're promoting your clubs and you have all of those flyers. Some key questions you can ask yourselves are those flyers and promotions screen readable if I'm sending them out digitally, right? Do I have different formats? Do I have a physical flyer? Can I put a QR code on it to then go to a more screen readable option, right? How big is that QR code? What are the colors we're using for our promotion? All of those things are questions you can start asking yourselves in terms of trying to make just from the invite to the end more accessible for your students. Go ahead and next. So think about venue and seating. That's when like physical accessibility comes into place. Where is it located on campus? Is it central or is it far off campus? Even thinking about what transportation needs there are for students, right? When you're thinking about the way you're setting up the venue or the room, is there space in between seats for people with maybe mobility aids or mobility needs to be able to navigate that space effectively? Think about options for people who may need to take breaks in the middle of your sessions. Are you incorporating those into your breaks for people who may have trouble sitting for a long time, whether that's due to chronic pain or whether that's due to just a need for a different type of stimulation or stemming, right? Go ahead and get to the next one. Presentations kind of go along with venue and promotion. So with presentations, do you have a need for something like interpretation or an interpreter, right? Do you have a need for things like captions? Are your captions accurate? Can you provide presentations after the fact or before the fact to be able to give students access and prep them for the information that you're going to go over? And then again, tie that back to things like screen readers and or your seating and your venue. A big thing within presentations and or groups is being able to set an agenda and be able to tell students what to expect from those presentations at the beginning of the presentation so they can identify how to meet their needs as well. These are things that we can tie into universal design, which implies that one level of accessibility can be incorporated into every event and helps more than just the disabled community. We got another bullet point down there. Other considerations. Considerations are going to be contingent on the format of your event, but you can consider things like seating. You can consider things like lighting. You can consider things like breaks. You can also consider things like involving people before an event even happens. So when you're creating these events, let's think with the student in mind and inquire about those specific needs so we can support those specific students. When we can't do that through this universal design or that level of accessibility. Then we're going to move to accommodations. So go ahead and click that button. So an accommodation is a change in environment or event that allows someone with a disability to have equal opportunities. So we've done all of our due diligence and we've tried to plan in a way that's most accessible to our student population. But we're going to acknowledge that we can't always do everything, and this is always a developing area. So we're going to try to support some level of an accommodation, right? So there are various accommodations. Can I get another click, Brian? So various accommodations can include things, a variety of things, and people go, well, what do I need to put into place? And my answer to them is, you don't necessarily always know. But a way to get to know is to always put an accommodation statement on any of your flyers, any of your event requests, so that you give a student the opportunity and a level of reach out / safety to where they feel they can request what they need. A simple accommodation statement placed on the bottom of your flyers and or even within your club's page as far where you're posting your events can really help them reach out and tell you what they need. So just something to consider. That's a sample of an accommodation statement you could copy and paste and place on any of your events. So who's responsible? This came up and has come up in years past as far as interpreting specifically. The one thing I can say about interpreting is you don't have to proactively provide everything. Interpreting is a good example. We would love to be able to do that, but there are some realities to working for a university and having a student club. Interpreters cost money, right? So before you have an event, placing that accommodation statement allows access through people who may need that service to request it. So now you're not buying this interpreter and no one in the crowd is utilizing it, right? Your department's responsible for the coordination and delivery of accommodations for your events. They're also responsible for the budget. So if you have questions and there's an accommodation request that comes through, and you go, I don't necessarily know who's going to pay for this or how it's going to be delivered. Chris is a great person to follow up with. Chris Randosh is a great person to follow up with that question. If he has questions on how best to do that, he'll always come to me and go, hey, Stephen, here's this request. How are we going to make that happen? But your first line of defense in terms of accommodations requests where you may feel you need some additional support would be Chris. This is recorded, so hopefully Chris doesn't mind. So we provided accessibility. We prompted some accommodations on top of that. But really the important thing is that all students feel not just included, but affirmed. So when we look at inclusive, let's think about who we're inviting to the event and have we created this space with them in mind, right? We went through these previous slides, and within these previous slides, what we said was we want to generate this sense of awareness, right? And we want to start asking the questions on, is this physically accessible? I always say, is this physically accessible? Is it digitally accessible? And then the last part that really comes in with inclusion and affirmation is it emotionally accessible for students? Do they feel safe enough to even voice their needs? And so when we're thinking of inclusion, those three elements are really important. And then when they feel included, do they feel affirmed as far as, is it a welcoming place where they can interact the way they want and in a manner in which is reinforced by the community around, where they feel part of that bigger TU community? And so here are some things to keep in mind. Who are we reaching out to? Who are we envisioning as far as attendees? Do these attendees have different identities? Are we actively ensuring that the spaces are welcoming? And that ties back to that emotional accessibility and making sure that we don't just think of, is it welcoming for someone who may need that physical accessibility, but also for folks who may have non-apparent disabilities and need other sorts of supports. And then we're going to move to affirming, to where we're going to use this strengths-based model of looking at how people can contribute within your clubs and student organizations. Everybody has different ways of approaching, and that's the beauty of life, is those different ways make us better. So how can we empower people to interact with others and to leverage their strengths? Then we're going to say, are we recognizing those strengths, fostering those strengths, but also acknowledging that things can be challenging? It's okay to say, hey, I noticed this challenge. How can I help you go through that? It doesn't mean you have to even relate that to a disability. A lot of times people will say, well, how do I know if someone has a disability or doesn't? Really, the way that you're approaching things, it shouldn't always matter, right? When it comes to fostering things and acknowledging challenges, you can speak to the challenge without speaking to a diagnosis. That's usually the best way to go about things, so that when people feel comfortable enough or feel like they need to disclose, they can. We can acknowledge there's a challenge without acknowledging or assuming that it has to do with that disability. That goes back to universal design and helping all students. We want to, if people do feel like they safe enough to disclose, we want to refrain from judgment and shaming or bringing unnecessary attention to behaviors. So assumptions can be harmful. Just because it looks different, if it's not harmful, we shouldn't bring additional attention. If someone's either accessing their environment differently, accessing information differently, all of that should be accepted, and we should look at how we can utilize and or adapt our environments to make those students feel safe. And then last, we're going to take steps to be aware of possible biases that we have within ourselves as far as disabled and neurodivergent people. That draws back to assumptions. We all have bias, right? The important thing is that we examine that bias, and when or if it shows up, we navigate around it by doing self-work and proactively trying to address it within our student organization. Dr. Chris and I always do an allyship training every year. It will be this year as well. You will see it marketed. This is a really, really, really shallow dive on some really deep stuff, right? But within that allyship training, we build and cultivate greater awareness while talking about strategies on how to help support your student organizations. We'll also have a Tiger Stripes program that generally it's neurodiversity and disability and what it means to lead, where we go into specific strategies within your student organization. But this is just to whet your palate and to get you to start thinking about these things so that that awareness can cultivate a level of action.
So we're at the halfway point, and we want to always welcome this session, chat, contributions, questions, comments. And right now, you can put in the chat. You can even do the virtual hand raise and come off if you're interested in using the mic. Steve, I have two questions that you made me think of in the last slide. It sounds like for the org with the best of intentions, it's really about framing if they receive a request, or if a new member or an existing member actually makes a request for support or accommodations, it sounds like, and tell me if you have a better way to language this, it's instead of focusing on what's your disability, it's what do you need? Like what support do you need? So it's less about, even with the best of intentions, not interviewing them or finding out more about what it is, and more about what is it they need to get the most out of the experience. So that was a ramble. What's your best advice or guidance on how to approach that when you're new to baking in more accessibility in your org?
I always say gently but directly. A lot of times people don't think they can ask. And if we reframe it to Brian's point as, let me ask about this specific behavior without assumption, it can help. The other thing I'll say is step away from the compound questions. Don't say things like, how do you feel and how can I help? Right? Those are two different questions, and that can overwhelm anybody. So saying, I noticed this. So like Brian, say, I noticed you looked a little anxious. Are you okay? And letting Brian go, yeah, I'm fine. Not anxious at all. And I go, okay, cool. Right? Like that's my interpretation of your body language. You could be feeling whatever you feel, and that's okay. Or it gives Brian an opportunity to say, yes, Stephen, I'm feeling a little anxious. And it's because I didn't get any sleep last night, right? That's not disability related, but then I can still help. Or if someone chooses to disclose, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit anxious this morning. I wasn't able to take my medication, right? That's okay too. Then the question still remains the same on, okay, how can I help? Right? What steps can I take? And no matter where Brian is, Brian's able to respond. And you're able to present an environment that's unassuming, that's gentle but direct, and that is calling someone in instead of calling someone out. As soon as I go, Brian, you look anxious. Do you have anxiety? That's calling someone out. And it's based off of assumption and our own bias. But if I say, Brian, this is what I'm observing, am I right in that? Right? Then it moves to either yes or no. And if it's no, then the conversation starts there. And then going, can I help in any way? And if Brian says no, then it stops there. That's another thing. People are okay to be anxious every now and then, right? If Brian goes, no, I had a bad day and I'm really not about it. Go, okay, Brian, cool. Well, I'm here if you need me, right? And then that also then generates a level of safety within that community. So, but thanks for calling that out. I appreciate it.
Any other questions in the chat? Thank you for doing this presentation. I feel like it's very necessary to include for other orgs to know and to advocate. So it's a rep from the DSU, the Disabled Student Union. I have not a question, but a comment. So my department, most of what we do is offer education and professional development training to the entire campus. So years ago, one of the many things that we offer is, and you'll hear a lot this year about this idea of dialogue skills, and that will be my focus in the second half. It was a request for getting the slides in advance, and that's a reasonable request. What we found, the team, and I will speak to student orgs. Life happens, and as you're planning for your regular meetings or presentations, often we end up having to edit things and tweak things at the last minute. That's reality. And how do we begin to shift the focus to say, if we're really going to live by this idea of belonging, we have to adopt a system that allows us to finalize things in advance in the event that someone needs to request the documents, the slides, the resources, what have you. And I can share from my team the reality of, oh, the initial reaction is like frustration. Oh, which can easily become this other bias of blame, like, oh, we have to go out of our way to go early. No, we have to be early because a good org that's inclusive should follow deadlines and have stuff ready in advance. So I share that to say we are all works in progress. We are all continuing to grow. And the reality is, how do we make sure that we support ourselves and our colleagues and our orgs to hold each other accountable and to also be willing to be vulnerable and say, initially, I came with the bias of I wanted to sort of blame the request of it makes it harder for us. No, the reality is it's reminding us of the work that we still need to do. So that reframe is just what I've seen and what I've felt with for myself and my own team is like we have to do better. We have to keep trying to do better. So yeah.
I'll even place, this is by no means a deep dive, and I wish I could, this is something that I talk about all day, every day to students. So hopefully y'all think about coming to the Tiger Stripes event. One of my second slides on every one of mine, or like maybe it's the fourth. Sometimes I do the language slide first. But either way, is we all drop the ice cream, right? We all make mistakes. And a lot of times we get so nervous to ask the questions to the people we know may have some better answers, or we are scared out of our own development and our own progress, right? And so we don't want that. So I want to also say, um, I'm Stephen Willems. I'm at Accessibility and Disability Services. If you have questions, you have concerns with your student organization, if you just want to learn yourself, come to the Tiger Stripes or just give me ask me the question. If it's something I can't answer, okay. But I don't, there's no judgment in someone trying to better themselves and better their student organization. We all do make mistakes, and that's okay. The important thing is that we process that and we move forward to a more equitable student org.
Ditto. The previous thing that Stephen said about thinking about the best way to ask the question, I'm going to use that as a segue to the second chunk of content for today. We want to point to this larger idea of increasing our skills for especially when there's an interaction. It could be in person, it could be virtually, when the interactions are getting heated, when emotions are involved, when there's a strong disagreement. And in the world we live in 2025, it seems like we're seeing more opportunities that wants to pull people in to knock down, drag out arguments, debates. And we want to point to another skill set that gives you skills to navigate best when there's that strong difference of perspective. So I want to do a quick review of this idea of dialogue, what it means and what it doesn't mean. I'm not saying that you must always point a dialogue as your best method of interaction. It's just one of many that's useful depending on your goal at the time. So there's two graphics I want to quickly wrap through. And again, as I mentioned in the chat, you're going to get these slides. How do we think about different types of interaction? In this graphic, and by the way, the face on either side of the three continuum is meant to indicate two different people. We need to do a clear TU version of this graphic. It looks like the same person. It's not meant to be. So I'm going to literally rip it apart from the bottom up. Different types of interactions and communication. First up, at the bottom, the purpose of a debate is to rigorously test typically between two possible views. Debate also is, if you think about the US electoral process, debate is an opportunity for voters to learn all they can to make the best choice for them between two or more candidates. A debate, if the goal is to rigorously test between a couple of positions or views, you want to debate. You want to set parameters, you want to judge, you want to critique. Now, often debate refers to the passionate emotions that are increasing knockdown, drag out fight in an org, in a group meet chat for the org, where you're going back and forth and you lose track of what the actual purpose is, and it becomes what feels like a personal attack. So debate as a framework is useful. Remember or know, TU, by the way, has a rich history of a nationally award-winning debate team. It's an actual skill folks can learn to grow. But as a method of interaction, there may not always be opportunities where within your org you want to set up debates. So what are some other alternatives? Discussion refers to, and I'm going to do a visual. I'm going to sit in my chair that has wheels and spins. Picture for discussion. An e-board member or a presenter has a prompt or a question, and their goal is inclusion. So they'll put a prompt and they will literally pass the mic and give everyone a chance to answer the question, or they may say pass, but you want to give everybody an opportunity to respond to a prompt. So picture discussion is you want everyone to have a chance. And that's the best of intentions. Now, there are many opportunities you can think about, moments in your org where that makes sense. You want everyone to have feedback. And there are some opportunities where it's not the best time to make sure. If you have an org with 70 members, There are some times in meetings where you don't want to literally pass the mic. Now, you might find virtual ways to collect feedback or polling, but discussion's also a useful framework when it makes sense. What does that lead? Well, dialogue sets it up. The goal of the dialogue is not to ensure the mic has been passed. It's an opportunity to focus more on my listening and how to hone it rather than what people are wanting to share. So a dialogue is an opportunity to focus on a deeper kind of listening that is listening to get more of somebody's story behind their view. And it's not about a finish line of who's right or who's wrong. Dialogue is more ambiguous. In a dialogue, you're going in wanting to listen and be a sponge. And often, when you adopt a framework for part of a meeting or part of an event to be set up as a dialogue, you don't know where it's going to end. But you're going to focus on practicing, are we doing all we can to capture the stories of our members that help explain why there might be an occasional difference of opinion? That's one graphic. I want to share one more that looks at different types of interactions, but it frames it around your larger goals. So this one sets up different types of interactions, but it maps it on this 2x2 matrix along two poles. How much of your goal is to be one way or two way, and I'll explain what that means, and how much of your goal is centered around competition versus cooperation. So we're going to go clockwise. In the lower quadrant, debate. As I mentioned, the goal of a debate is to rigorously test views or candidates. Sometimes the goal of a debate is to persuade and to win. You hopefully do that by asking great questions. Sometimes we've seen in the example of electoral politics, sometimes we've seen attempts to win by making less of not just the other argument, the other person making the argument. So it literally can get personal in some debates. Debate is useful when your goals are to be competitive, and that could be test the strongest view, find out the best candidate for you, the best candidate for an e-board role. And debate is defined as two-way because there literally is often this binary of you've got two or sometimes more than two choices from which you're going to test or critique. Wrapping around along the clockwise continuum from debate, we go to diatribe. You didn't see diatribe in the earlier graphic. Diatribe is one way. There is somebody who has the actual perceived power or authority. Think of an e-board officer role. And in that moment, when it says competitive, they have information that needs to be shared to the membership. In an org, it's when an officer has a report or a presenter has the stage. In real life, if you picture the example of politics, annual State of the Union address by the sitting president. Everybody in Congress gathers in one space. This person with all the actual perceived power has the mic, has the speech. We all leave. So in certain settings within your org, it's valuable to set it up where one person who has the authority or the power or the rank needs to share certain things. An officer report, for example. So in some cases, it's useful. You want to pick it and you want to adhere to it. When I showed you discussion in the earlier graphic, in this graphic, you see this idea of discourse. So in the upper quadrant, here comes discourse. They're, for our purposes, interchangeable. Where I said discussion is you pass the mic. Discourse is there's opportunities for everyone to have an opportunity to share their view. The biggest question we get with this graphic, people get why it's cooperative. You want everyone to feel part of the discussion. The biggest question on this graphic is why is it one way? Because you're passing a mic to everyone, right? It's one way because generally one person is asking the prompt or deciding the prompt. How many of you had a class where the instructor has a question and then wants everyone to respond to it? So it's cooperative because you want to make sure members feel like they have a chance to have their say, but it's seen as one way because typically somebody crafted the agenda for that meeting or decided on what the prompts are. That leaves, once again, this idea of dialogue. It's two-way because it's, as I mentioned earlier, often no one knows where it's going to end. You're going to stay wrapped around listening. You're going to stay in curiosity. It's cooperative because in these spaces, while you generally want to have one or two people who are facilitating, they're really holding space for the unknown. It's an opportunity to hone in on just focusing on listening, not about responding. It's listening purely to understand and learn more about each other, not listening to reply or to clap back or to argue or even listening because you want to fix someone's problems. So dialogue requires a different mindset and it requires a different type of listening. So why are we wanting to promote this skill more and more across Canvas? One, because the research tells us that when a group practices a skill as a group, they go through these stages of building better connections and more authentic group dynamics. So this SAGE theory that comes out of social psychology, when a group commits to this skill set and to regularly practicing, step one, they learn more and more deeply about each other. They learn better skills on how to respectfully and appropriately challenge each other. You still want to make space for diversity of views, by adapting these skill sets, you actually, this idea of storming, you learn better how to respond to each other, learn about each other, and you learn skills to question and challenge each other. I want to point back to what Steven said earlier. Think about how you ask the question. That exactly comes from honing your skills around dialogue skills. And then the group, as you keep at it, you learn different and deeper levels of working together. And ultimately, it improves group function based on your group's mission. You just work better as a more cohesive, and here comes belonging again. Members are more cohesive, and therefore they feel like they're part of the larger org. That's the framework. I want to begin to wrap up with a couple of skills to point to. Um, if you are interested, and by the way, another shameless plug, we're going to be rolling out across the campus this year more opportunities to learn and practice the skill set. So if you're thinking about it, it requires that you take time to prep. It means setting up and establishing some norms for each group or each meeting. It reminds being really clear about clarity on intentions and acknowledging that it's a skill you're practicing. As Steven said earlier, this notion of try it, learn, you're going to drop the ice cream. I love that framing. You will make mistakes, but be willing to approach it as a group and support each other through that process. The last new idea it's important to think about within working towards better belonging and inclusion, it's intent and impact. The other area that I support in my department is bias support and advocacy, which means reports of bias or possible discrimination. If they don't warrant a discrimination investigation, they come to my team for finding out what support or resources. And one of the things that we often do is to hold conversations, educational moments, or facilitated dialogues for people who have either experienced harm or some level of bias. And the core thing that we stress for the Canvas is there is a difference between focusing on the intent versus the impact. When harm happens, harm can be bias, harm can be discrimination, harm can be any level of hurt. It's important to remember as a community that cares about belonging, you want to prioritize the impact, not the intent. So this graphic waters down that intent and impact. In this picture, you've got the driver of the vehicle and the person that appears to have been hurt by the vehicle. The only thing you have as far as commentary is the driver is saying, I didn't mean to run over your foot. I am a good driver. But the question is, did harm happen? Absolutely. Look at how the international sign for pain, the red, and the international sign for tears, the blue. This person was absolutely physically harmed, emotionally harmed. Uh, as a caring community that prioritizes belonging, we focus on the impact, not the intent. The intent is irrelevant when one or more of our community has been harmed or worse. So the other slides that you will have access to that I won't share is to hone in on other ways to think about intent and impact. And then the last thing I'm going to point to in this slide before we take final comments, this goes right to what Steven said earlier about questions. The last resource slides talk about some reflection you can do to improve the kinds of questions you really make the most sense in that moment. So if you think about it, what am I trying to do if I'm setting up an agenda or discussion? In terms of the best way to ask the most appropriate question, what am I trying to do with it? What's the impact I want to have? And how do I actually word it? It requires its own reflection and practice. So this next graphic gives you an idea to think about different types of questions. First category, the simple closed question. Literally, it's yes, no. It has one of two answers. Have you been to TU before? Is this your first org meeting? Yes or no? Did I hear that correctly? In the middle category, it's the leading question. If I ask everyone, how awesome is it to be at TU? It assumes that everyone always feels like it is awesome to be at TU. Do you acknowledge whether it's leading or not? If your goal is to capture positive quotable quotes, go with it. If you're really trying to capture individual stories, you want to shift the wording of that. Here comes the third category of open-ended. You start with the most generic, ambiguous question. How's it going? How's it been for you being a member of this org? It is meant to be broad because you want to welcome whatever they're willing to share. So even with the ways that you want to set up well-intended questions, take a breath and a moment, and sometimes in advance to think about being real careful and intentional with your questions. I want to stop sharing slides. We want to leave the last few minutes for us to have questions, to keep using the chat, or to even come off mic to ask questions or request other info from either or both of us. While we're waiting, I've got one request to use the chat if you're willing to. If you're willing to. Can you think of one tangible thing that you can easily start doing in your org that's going to improve the continual pursuit of real belonging? Are there tangible things that you can see applying anything that was shared today? And if you're willing and able to put it in the chat as strategies, we want to leave with hands-on things that we can all take back to our different orgs. And you can put in the chat or you can come up mic and speak with us.
I was going to give them the unmute option as well. Okay. So sure.
Sarah says, in terms of marketing a club on social media or around campus, what would you say are the most important ways to make posts or banners, etc., accessible and inclusive?
Oh, good question. So I can give you a workaround that's going to help, to be honest. So there are two ways. One is you can try to make things screen readable. And a lot of your features, as far as where you're developing stuff, whether it's Canva or other apps, will have accessibility gauges on the side. Your Blackboard posts absolutely will. Well, I don't know if you're using Blackboard or another sort of system. So that's also a good question on it. If you give me your system, I can give you a more specific answer. But I will say this, even when things aren't accessible. So say your poster or flyer isn't screen readable. You can always put the narrative of that in an email that it's attached to and be as descriptive as you can within that email, because your emails through Outlook are always going to be able to be read through a screen reader or copied and pasted and read out loud. So that's a good workaround as far as what you're posting. The other thing I can say is look at your text size on your flyers and look at your font size on your flyers. Even if you did for more information and a large QR code, if that comes up with your information that you have on your campus org site, that will also be able to be read. So there are some workarounds depending on how you're posting and what you want to post. My 2 cents is that if it's emailed out, always make sure to have a very, very robust description under that. And then if you are utilizing flyers, think of text size and think of contrast. So when it comes to on a white piece of paper, if you put yellow, that's not going to be very visible to someone. So think about those high contrast colors to try to make things more visible for people who may have vision impairments or otherwise. And then also, I'm just going to say this in general to everybody. Sometimes more succinct is better than more complex, right? Like complexity is cool and everything, but how can I say this in the most simplest of terms with the fewest of words so that people know where something is, what it's going to be about, and what time it is? Lastly, what I will say about promoting your events, make sure you're explicit on what you're doing. The more someone knows about what they're headed into, the better they can prep or decide for themselves if it's an accessible and or good environment for them to be in. I tell people this all the time as far as like, I'm not going to make a rock concert a low STEM environment, right? But I can let people know at a rock concert they can expect this, so they can opt out of that opportunity and into another one that your club or organization has. Did that help answer your question, Sarah?
We're gonna put into the chat. Yes, Sarah says yes. Speaking of other methods of accessibility, so TU's colors are black, gold, and we use white and gray. I've learned from a colleague years ago, there are different contrast checkers. This one website is one. I'm going to quickly share it. It's interesting that often some of the TU branded templates can have you have black, gold, or white text. Interestingly, if you choose the combination of black text on the gold background, like the score in the middle is green. But look at what happens if I want to do yellow or gold text on a white background. The rating goes down. In other words, any combination of white text on a gold TU gold background, for many people, certainly color blindness, it often is not even legible. So these are the resources that we want to keep pushing out, sharing with each other. You can search for a variety of contrast checkers. These are just one of many other approaches to think about your entire function of your org. So the work never ends, but we want to make sure that you know where to go for more resources. You've got Chris to always start with, you've got our two offices, and we are always able to keep adding more and more resources that we're all learning. It is 3:59. We know that the clothing session is running from 4 to 4:15, so we will.
You have one question, Brian. Can you get it done in 1 minute?
Yeah. The idea is recommended helping to delete more productive. Yes. And the good news is you're going to hear with a university email soon. This year, there's a really, really cool campaign we're running around this idea of constructive dialogue. So there will literally be easy ways for you and your orgs to learn the skill sets. We've got some incentives. So hang tight. In the meantime, you can email my department and say, hey, don't forget us. Give us a few weeks to start announcing it. There's a really cool, exciting initiative happening all this year for students and employees to learn the skill. So you're going to hear about it very soon, but you are welcome to reach out if you want to learn. If you're ready now, email me and I'll fill you in. Thank you all. It's 4 o'clock. You want to get back to your closing and assessment Zoom room and enjoy the rest of your day. And you're welcome back to a new semester.